Hi, everybody. Today we meet with Kevin Moore, someone who possesses this rare ability to balance technical depth with an understanding of customers and business needs. I've known Kevin almost forever at this point. First reputation starting at Microsoft and more recently in real life at Google, where our paths cross quite frequently. Throughout all the time I've known Kevin, though, he has spent a lot of his time thinking about how to help developers be successful. In this chat, we get a glimpse into the insights and sheer energy he brings into this challenging and fun problem space. Let's get started. Kevin, it's great to chat with you. You're one of those people that I've known for a large part of my career through reputation, but only got to meet you pretty much like maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So great to chat with you. And for the rest of the audience, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kevin Moore. Um, I like my Twitter bio because it reminds me to like what's important in life because we always introduce ourselves to what we work on. It's like, so I'm a very lucky husband. I have an amazing wife. Proud father of three kids. And oh, by the way, I'm a computer guy at Google. It'll be 10 years December, which is kind of bananas to think. Time flies so fast. And the whole time I've worked on Dart and then Dart and Flutter. It kind of Flutter came along after we did the Dart thing, and Dart, we're still doing the Dart thing. But and my focus right now, work wise, on Dart and Flutter is the web stack. So I proudly say I'm the only one on the team that owns a vertical. You know, there are people that own the Android story, and Michael owns the Dart kind of low level platform story. But I own the web story, which is both low level stuff. So you think about we have two JavaScript compilers, we have APIs for doing interop with JavaScript. We now have a WebAssembly compiler, which we still kind of classify in the web space, although there's lots of interest in the server there. Maybe we'll talk about that later. And then how we present and deploy Flutter apps on the web. So all the way down to the compilers and thinking about interop with low-level JavaScript, all the way up to how we deal with WebGL and URLs and all those fun things.
Yeah, and your official title is a product manager, but do you see yourself as a product manager or a developer, or where do you like see yourself spending most of your time in?
Um, Actually, lately I've been pretty good about sticking with product management. I was notorious. I think notorious was probably the right term for a while. Where despite my role being product management, I did a lot of engineering, and I still do quite a bit. I love to code. I love solving problems. My joke, you joked earlier, I could be slightly more loose about my language than maybe I would be with a standard or a, a Google thing. But my joke for a long time has been I'm an engineer that's disproportionately good at BS, and so it's like you talk too much. So maybe we should make you a product manager because I do love talking to customers. Thinking, my flippant way of saying it is I like being invited to all the meetings, that the meetings where important things are discussed and figured out. Thinking at the strategic level is really fun. But I do also like being able to go deep and looking at commits that into the Flutter engine or the Dart SDK, landing patches myself. I love doing that.
All right. We'll touch upon all these topics, but let's go back in time. Let's go back to, a long, long time ago when how did you get started in computers? Like what made you choose to take the path of being a developer and then a product manager and so on? Like what was the first thing you ever remember going like, this is what I want to do the rest of my life?
My wife would, I've never been one who's like a little bit maybe, what I'm going to do when I'm older. It's always generally been kind of like what I like doing now. And there's so many places to start there. I remember having this visceral thing like my junior year of college where I had friends who were like, "Oh, I'm going to switch majors," and they effectively go from being a junior to a freshman in terms of their requirements and things, and having this angst and uncertainty about what I want to do with my life. And I'm really having a memory about a memory. It's almost like a um, I don't know what kind of movie, but I remember having this almost a guilty feeling. My small town Midwest comes out, which is I've never had that. Like I have always known that I was going to do computers, just always. My dad bought a computer. I think I was a third grader. It was a Xeos computer with 1 meg of RAM and an EGA monitor. And I remember my mom posted on the internet, or she sent me a link. I tweeted it, I think, with the invoice. She found the invoice for that computer. And I mean, it's funny thinking about it. Like it was, with inflation, it'd be like $3,500 now. So like the cost of a Vision Pro, for an EGA monitor and 1 meg of RAM, and I think a 30 meg hard drive and a 5.25 inch, floppy drive, and GW Basic. And so I learned to program in GW Basic, and I wrote code to like calculate prime numbers and print them out. It was hilarious. I set this program running, and I didn't even understand square roots at the time. It was I don't even like I look back now. I'm like I'd written that so much more efficiently in GW Basic. But yeah, that was the start. And then I got a job in high school at a company. I literally started mopping the floors and sweeping and breaking down boxes. And it was like the only company in my town that did anything with technology or electronics. Um, and then they said they're going to start doing web stuff. And so I started doing, it started out with Perl, and then it went to, oh gosh, I'm going to really date myself. Cold Fusion. Are you old enough to know Cold Fusion?
Absolutely, I'm
Oh yeah,
familiar with
we
Cold
did Cold
Fusion.
Fusion
Yeah.
for like all of 4 months, and
Yep.
then Active Server Pages V1.
Yes.
So was it? Wait, it wasn't script. It was Action Script, ASP, Active Server
No,
Pages,
ASP was, I think it used VB or JavaScript. I forget.
VB Script. It was VB
Yes.
Script. So that was my first time getting paid for running software was doing a tiny bit of Perl. Enough to know I hated it. But most of my time in high school, I was running VB Script, and doing like a real estate website, and all these fun things. Like we had the backing for the website for a long time was an Access database. So there's one computer upstairs that was like hosting website. I mean, it was a local thing, right? It wasn't dozens of hits a day. It wasn't big, but like for a long time, it was just ODBC. Remember all this stuff? To an Access database. And at some point, I'm like, maybe we should use SQL Server. Like maybe we should use a real database and not just like we'd open up the database on oh my God, I'd open up the database on my desktop. And it was like, I'm just hitting the file system while an active web server, just insanity that like, this is how we used to do things. This is well before the cloud. I remember when the table tag was like all these things. I remember when the table tag came out and like, oh my gosh. And like, look what I can do with a table tag. Like I am that old. I remember the table tag.
I mean, you're not that old, Kevin. Unless you're
It's
saying
all relative, right? It's all relative.
I'm also that old then, because
Right.
everything you spoke resonates with me very, very, very closely. Like we were doing Perl, was it for like the CGI kind of apps?
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah, there you go. Like when we saw a website with like CGI-bin in the URL, that gave it an extra level of credibility. It's like, okay, these people know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
And with .asp extension at the end of it, that also gave it extra. Like, okay, they know a little bit more than like your typical GeoCities or Lycos, web host, kind of people. To the point where I would actually take my regular HTML files and just change the extension to .asp just to give myself extra street cred.
This is dynamic.
Exactly. And the only thing dynamic was, I started off with the web editor that came with the browser. So front page editor and the Netscape composer.
Oh yeah.
Because they, like, I didn't know how to write a table. So I would like click the little table button, enter the grid and rows, manually like an animal, hit enter. And that's it. There you go. You have like the limited set of things you could do. And that's what really got me interested in this whole world. And the funny thing you mentioned also, right? Did you ever do anything like Apache, like scripting in the backend for like because server side includes were the only thing that was dynamic back then for like how do you create templates. I was wondering, did you ever go deep into that rabbit hole, or are you more on purely on the Apache and the server side of things?
We weren't. It's always interesting to look back at kind of the little things that you start with and how you stick with it, right? So we were a Windows shop. It was a Microsoft shop. The company also it's called R&D Industries. I think RDI1.com. It's still around in Milford, Iowa. You can go find it now. Don's still the guy who I work with, still running it. We were an ASP shop. But one thing I do remember though is I wrote, even thinking of, we'll get into this, like thinking about frameworks, thinking about reusability. Like I made a login system, and I remember there was no notion of encapsulation. So if you wanted to do something where you had something at the top of the page and the bottom of the page, maybe you wanted to like omit the content if they weren't logged in and then show the content if they were, what you had to do, it was just seriously just inserting code. So you had to include one file at the top of the page and a separate file at the bottom of the page. And they had to be like, it's like, beginning and end, and you had to insert the right files at the right hierarchy in the HTML. And then they worked together, and the variables just flowed through. There was no encapsulation. You could stomp on variables. It's all global. But it worked. And so like I made this little reusable authentication system so that you could like so the people at the real estate website could go and like log in and change their real estate entries. And it was even interesting thinking about that. They used to call us and they would send us an FTP up. Here's all the images and here's all the descriptions for the properties. I mean, think about managing real estate. And I did all this work. It's like, oh, well, we'll set it up so you can manage your own properties. And they're like, this is so weird. This is something that like, why are now you're charging us so we do the work? I was like, but we're charging you $50 an hour, which at the time now it'd be like 300 or something. Who knows? But it's like, but we're now letting you do this. Like, you don't have to email us and wait 3 days for us to change your images. Like, you could do it and like explain to them that this is a feature, right? I just fundamentally new. I mean, this is back when you could copy and paste like HTML table bombs into a guest book and destroy someone's website, right? I of course never did that, but there's there was always the discussion of like, oh yeah, like I was probably the first kid in my block to understand the importance of HTML and SQL injection and improper escaping. It's very important.
It was a fun time back then because no one really knew what they're fully doing, and there weren't that many resources on what needs to be done. Like there were no best practices. Is it really secure and all of these things? So it's like, yeah, I'm just gonna cobble together whatever works and hope it works in the latest version of Netscape and Internet Explorer, if Internet Explorer was even out at the time in a usable state.
IE4 was just like I remember the days. It was like I was Netscape and like, oh, this IE thing. I remember seeing Windows 95 the first like all that stuff. Yeah.
Yep. One of the things I worked on very early in high school was an automotive dealership where they needed someone to update the cars that would go up on their website. Exact same story right here. Like they literally email me pictures of like cars. I would take it in at the time I used Microsoft Image Composer. It came free with Office basically.
Of course,
And I just resize it, put a little, weird clip art of like, a little star and put a price inside it. It was tacky as ever. I mean, it's almost, to be fair though, car sales ads even today, like the flyers you get in your paper, like really thin paper that comes to your mailbox, they're tacky as well. I just
it hasn't really evolved much. Yeah.
It hasn't really evolved much. And that's exactly what I did. I was like, okay, they send me like a couple dozen photos a week. I'd go and do the exact same thing. I was like, you know what? You can do this yourself. You can do this in-house. You don't have to email this to me. So when you mentioned that, you were doing a CMS, in my case, I pretty much optimized myself out of a job with them because, they were like, oh, we have to do this ourselves now. Whereas I think you had much better luck. I think you just, they were still paying you all, but you just didn't work for them. Yeah, very clever on that side.
Yeah, like, it was also fun too, because this idea of like front end, back end design, like, oh no, I did it all. So I did. Oh my gosh! I have backflashes. I actually looked in the Wayback Machine. There's a company called Hogemeyer Hybrids, and they were a corn company. This is Iowa, right?
Yeah.
And I made a tiled, like the background of their website was a tiled corn kernel, a big one, like 60 pixels by 60. Like it was big, and it was like imagine like the most gratuitous like yellow and orange tiled background, and then it had an animated GIF. It was like their little like old school truck that hauled the corn and like an animated loop across the top of the webpage, and they loved it. And now it would be like retro cool, but like complete, to quote my 12-year-old, like so cringe. But yeah, like, and I got, I made $7 an hour making this silliness, it was fun.
Yeah, I don't know if you watch The Simpsons much, but there was a great scene where like Homer's first webpage, was basically displayed, which is basically just like a typical cyan background Times New Roman text, and it's like random things moving for no purpose, and it's like they're moving, little hit counter at the bottom. And
oh my gosh, yes,
I think it was a Mr. X episode actually, in The Simpsons, classic episode. It went from being like, wow, that's terrible, to like you mentioned right now, it's retro cool. Now it's like everyone's trying to get back to that.
So I'm going to quiz you now. What is the darkest color, the darkest gray that's not black, that's in the HTML safe color palette? What is the hex?
Ooh. I want to say 111.
So my memory, and it'd be interesting to see in the doobly-doo, the comments below. Remember, like it was multiples of 51. So it's 51, 51, 51, and then 102, 102, 102. Like, and there was some notion of like the web safe profile for colors. So if you're going to pick a color, you want to pick, because like this is back when people still had 256 color screens.
Yes.
And so it's like, oh, like we'll stay in this safe palette so that you won't, I forget what it's called, when like, when a 16-bit color image or, would get downsampled and look bad. So it's like, oh no, we'll stay in this like web safe subset of colors, and all the units of the hex value were multiples of 51. And so like, oh gosh, it was FFF, and then the next one was like, I think DDD or CCC, CCC, like, and you could use any combination, and that
Yeah,
was
there was
that
like
was the safe
six six
palette.
six and EEE and so
Yeah,
on, right?
like I
Yeah,
and again, it'd be interesting to see if this is we're either going to completely bore people or like we're totally
no,
like the
it's not gonna. No.
back in my day.
People know what to expect when they're listening to this, Kevin.
Okay,
So
okay,
they know
all right,
exactly.
all right.
Because I don't remember this, but I do know that when it exports some images in Fireworks, speaking of tools that no longer around or optimized for the web, there was always a drop down for Web 216 optimized, like 216 colors. And I
Right.
always in the back of my mind was wondering, where happened to the other 50 colors? Like, why is the other 50 not there? It may have something to do with what you kind of mentioned here, like for web safe, certain colors probably just don't really work really
Oh,
well. But
it was dealing with dithering and creating
dithering, that's
GIFs,
right. It is dithering. That's the right word.
and you had to create GIFs, and GIFs were it was low colored GIFs were low. So if you want to do animated GIFs, you needed to pick in this safe palette
Correct.
because or otherwise you get ugly dithering when you yeah.
That's
The
right.
things kids these days don't understand how, and dial up networks and spinning hard drives 5400. Yeah, like this is you know
I mean, I always tell people, like, for me, the most magical moment was like when my 28.8 US robotics modem got a firmware upgrade for the V90 standard. And once I installed it, I could now connect at a whopping, 48, 40 point, whatever the connection beyond it,
yeah.
because there were two competing standards, right? Like one was something that 3Com was maintaining. I think US robotics was not owned by 3Com at the time. Then there was one that Lucent was maintaining as well. And so depending on which ISP you chose, based on which of the modems that you had installed. It wasn't until that firmware upgrade that it all worked out. In my mind, I'm like blown away. I'm like, wait, what? I installed this weird piece of software, and of course, I don't know what bio screens look like these days. I'm on a Mac. I've been on a Mac forever now, but I
Yeah.
always imagine it's like really just gigantic, like blocky black or blue screen with like some text that says "hit enter," warning, stopping in the middle might cause the world to collapse, and then a few minutes later, everything turned off and then turned back on, and now you're in a whole new world.
I mean, oh gosh, you get into IRQs and DMAs, like the
That's right. Plug and
hardware.
play.
I mean, right now, I was I'm a company guy. I think, did I joke with you about this? Like, I unironically owned a Zune when I worked at Microsoft. And I have a snowboard still that has a Zune sticker, and now it looks ironic. I'm like, no, at the time I put it on unironically. So I was a loyal. I was one of the first people to use Stadia, and I won't get into it because smart people worked on things, and software is hard. Services are hard. But I use Stadia, and then now if I'm playing my AAA games, I use the NVIDIA GeForce streaming thing.
Yeah.
And so every once in a while, like I'm running around medieval England playing Assassin's Creed, and I think like I used to wait for images to load, and I'm like on Wi-Fi, like streaming a AAA game in 4K, and like it's one of those like perspectives of history, like threes adding three zeros to bandwidth and like latency. It is amazing how far it's come in our
Yeah,
lifetimes.
it's mind-boggling, especially when you think of like how far compression technologies have gotten because our CPU is just so much more optimized. Like, the algorithms have always existed. It's just that how much the CPU do you pay per frame to make this work? Impossible 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah,
Now it's like trivial. They're like play mining Bitcoin on the side while playing a AAA game,
right.
and also like I don't know.
And my wife's upstairs on doing psychology with her clients, and it works. Yeah,
Exactly.
it's kind of amazing.
Yeah, no, the world has like it's one of the things I always talk about when I talk to like newer people and newer grads. My daughter's like 5, and she has no concept of like a touch. Everything's a touch screen. She like comes to my Mac and she's like touches the screen. I'm like, no, the Apple's current laptop lineup doesn't support touchscreens, for example. But then whenever it sees something brand new, right, for a brief moment, I do go back in time to be like, wait a minute, I remember back in the day it was A, B, and C, then all these things. So I feel like at least I waste at least like 50 or 100 milliseconds going back in time to figure all these things out. Whereas I'm already like, energy expended to the point I'm like, oh, wow, I need a break now. Whereas I feel like all the new people today, they don't have the concept of like what the world was back then. So when they see something new, the energy they have jumps to the future very quickly. Whereas I'm still like stuck in the present. I'm like, wow, that is mind-boggling where it came from. Like right now, we're talking about like how we came from like 28.8 to like right now. Whereas I always had a cynical view that someone newer who's like did not have experienced all those things will be like, wait, this is crap. I see a little bit of screen tear right here. How do we make this infinitely better? And I'm like, Wow,
Right.
I would never even be getting that point. I'd be like, I'd just be amazed at how good the state of technology is right now.
And at a transparent attempt to not bore people listening, because I could totally do the old man thing for a long time. But even thinking about product management, like it's um, what I'm not going to. I think it's genius, and I don't want to go so far because that's pretty, But the ability to hold contradictory two things in your head at once and not go crazy, intelligence or something. Like I aspire to do that. And so, how as a product person, how do you maintain excitement and awe of what you've built and what's possible, but also maintaining not a cynical eye, but a critical eye, right? Like, how could we, there's room for improvement, there's room for polish, we could always be better. And you need to do both, right? You need to simultaneously be, you know, find excitement in what you're delivered and what you have delivered and what's available now. And then, like, but there's so much work to do and do both. And it's tricky. It's not being a pessimist, but you need to be an optimist, but also an opportunist in terms of the opportunity we have for what we could build and how much better we can make things, right?
Yeah, it is a tension because you never know, like, does your own inherent experience bias you from seeing the next big thing? Or is it actually a skill where because you've seen these things before, you can spot like which of the many next big things are actually viable and the other ones are just basically, just noise that are in search of a solution.
Or the flip side of that, which is you've been you see the bug reports and you have very in both our communities, I think, right? Probably more so me, what I'm working on. And you see the issue reports and you see the people shaking their fists on Twitter and social media, and God bless them for being vocal and trying to be constructive. And so it's easy to get to beat yourself down about the state of things, and then you see survey results or talk to just random people at conferences, and you see like, oh, just like there's a lot of people that are just delighted and having a lot of fun and building really exciting things. And so, and again, you have to find the balance. It's tricky.
Yeah, I think there was an old phrase. So I think someone once said that, if you ask people what they want, they just ask for a faster horse, never
Yep.
an automobile, never a plane or anything like that. And that's also like, how do you balance some of these things out?
My favorite thing recently, it rhymes with that, which is if you were to ask a monkey how to get to the moon, they would say like, oh, I need to go find a taller tree.
Yep.
And so like, how do you switch your perspective? That is tricky too. Yeah, and then I deal with that too, right? Like, spreading peanut butter and making incremental improvements, and how much do you invest there versus, oh, we need to take time and really invest on a new thing. Like, we could be optimizing, Flutter web rendering. Like, there's always more opportunities there. It's like, okay, but there's this WebAssembly thing, and like, how do we balance our allocations there? Even though for a while no browser supported it, right? And it's I don't even know if there's a right recipe there. It just lots of experience, I guess.
Yeah, and a bit of luck as well, like intuition and luck and all these things play a role. The other phrase I remember, like, in college, I took a lot of economics classes. Basically, I majored in computer science, but I did not like any moment of it. My way of learning and things is very different than the way it was presented, like just like walls and walls of text. So I did the bare minimum needed to graduate a CS degree. I took a bunch of other classes instead I really enjoyed. In economics, there's one thing that always stuck with me is that at some point the profit of if you're a company and you're making a profit, at some point it'll be driven down to zero, either by competition or by just obsolescence in the market. You saturate the market too much. So it's always
Yep.
in your best interest to keep finding something new before you basically get to the point where you're like getting to zero, and so on. And I see that applies so much in our world all the time.
Peloton is my favorite case example of this. Like, Peloton had complete saturation of the market during the pandemic, and then once everyone who could and would wanted to buy a Peloton bought it, it's like, oh, like, yeah, it's
Exactly. And we always talk about like moats and sustainable advantages and things like that, which in developer tools, you worked in developer platforms and things for a very long time. And
20
you see it
years.
all the
Yeah,
time. It's
insane.
like, just between the things we talked about in the last like 20 minutes so far, all those technologies we talked about, they're still around in some form or fashion, but the players that were able to either build a business around it or monetize it and so on, are no longer the very same ones. Cold Fusion, no one really talks about much anymore. ASP, of course, became ASP.NET. The idea behind having scripting, whether it's in the browser or on the server, very much alive by many, many companies now at this point. But then things like server side includes like Apache programs, and so on. no one really thinks about it much. They all go the Rails route, or they go like the more modern route of like Next.js apps and so on, where you have dynamic front ends and back ends in a mono repo where your one single JavaScript code base handles all these things for you. And it's always funny seeing like 5 years from now how much of this would be seen as like, okay, no longer relevant anymore, but here's a net much better thing that's going to come out.
Oh wow, there's so many things to pick apart in just that.
Start
Yeah,
anywhere.
no, it's good, and maybe it ends up being this reflection of you know some things will always matter. Some things will always matter, right? You think about the importance of user experience, the thing about the importance of a responsive user experience, just the speed of light, like latency. So you think about the ability to do a streaming game, for instance, or you and I having this conversation here, right? Um, as good as our networks are, right? I'm sure we both have a good network. I'm assuming the podcasting software, whatever we're doing now, is recording a local copy. It's going to upload it later, so things are coordinated.
Exactly, which is the only reason why I use this particular one. It does exactly that.
And I think you and I are across a lake. I mean, 10 years ago we would have found a reason to get together, which may have been good to be in the same room with you. It's like, oh no, it's like I can just walk to the conference room and
And I also only saw you last week, so I can only take
yeah,
so much of you in
I
real
know.
life, in a time.
Exactly. Um, uh, so yeah, some things will always matter, and then I guess maybe that's the trick, right? Which is understanding, and I think this comes with some experience, which is there's a set of things that will always matter, like fundamentals, whether it's human nature, fundamentals of complexity, and whatever that is, like the complexity of your data, the complexity of your software, the complexity of the user experience you're building, realities of humans, and then there's things that are parochial that you just don't know. Like if you only ever did ASP, you're like, clearly this is the way you do things. Or if you've only ever programmed in one programming language, if you only ever used one operating system, um, like, oh, like there's actually many ways to do this. And even being around a while, like there's certainly benefits. I can't stay up till 4 in the morning coding anymore, but just seeing like how often things repeat. Because I mean, we were talking earlier. I worked on WPF, what we called Avalon at Microsoft. You and I both did. XAML, XML, like all this stuff. Like at the time, fresh out of college, it was like, oh, XML is everything. Of course, everything will be XML and SOAP. And it's like you've been around a while. We're like, there's many ways to encode data, and like this is overly verbose. Um, oh, I had another example, and it totally left me. But like these kinds of things, right? You're like, uh, or even just like clearly we need to make a proprietary stack and use the operating system to build all this stuff. And of course, now my experience with working on Flutter and other things is like you can make super high performance, high fidelity things that are completely open and run great everywhere, right? Like, and there's benefits to owning the stack, and there's trade offs there. Like, do you want to build something proprietary that people have to buy into, or do you want to build a platform that anyone can run anywhere? And there's inherent trade offs in those things, and so yeah, figuring out like what's flavor of the month versus like, oh, this is a fundamental truth about how things should work. It's tricky.
It very much is. And, you mentioned that idea about cycles, right? Like, we've been through a few cycles where we see the same story being played out with just like, slightly different cast, slightly different setting, but, pretty much the same story that's being played out. And, we've both worked on platforms that were successful and some that were horrifically not very successful at all. And the interesting thing though, right, is that right now, if you and I were asked to like go and build a new platform for doing something, we'll be taking all of our learnings and we'll try to optimize for like what will lead to the most amount of success for the product and the developers and things like that. You and I probably graduated college around probably at the same time, like probably early to mid 2000s, essentially, right?
Oh, two, yeah,
And
Iowa State, a proud grad, yeah.
yeah. And so, around that time, right, when we went there, when we started working on all these things, like, Avalon in your case, or for me, tooling on the WPF side and things like that, there were other people we were working with who already seen the cycle before. Like, this might have been our very first cycle that we've been actively involved in, but others have been there for a few cycles already. And the back of my mind always go like, let's say that I've been through 3 cycles, I've been through 3 cycles since that time period. The things we know now about how to build something that's going to do these things, the people we work with should have known as well, because they've probably been to their own sort of 3 cycles of how these things should have done. Yet, despite that, things did not go in the way it did. And I always go back, why did it not go the way it did? Was it deliberate? Because you can always optimize for various things in a large organization. One is, of course, making the customers happy, making the developers, especially developed platforms, making the developers happy. The other is making the platform that your company might be, selling. In the case of Microsoft, how much Windows? How do you make Windows be very successful, which might go counter to how to make developers happy, which might be open, easy to use, and things like that. And then there also is purely personal gains as well. Inventing a shiny new object is personally better for me as a career. Growing my team abnormally would be personally better for me as a career. And so I'm going to optimize for those kind of angles. And so whenever I look back at it, I'm always like thinking like, I can see these people had these agenda items. I can align with why they were doing these kind of things. And then, it gives you a whole different color from that point of view. And I was curious if you ever had the same experience.
Oh, interesting. I remember, I guess it's been, pushing 20 years now. So I remember being in meetings. I worked on Longhorn at Microsoft. And so, I mean, I'm sure there's been Harvard Business Review case studies, or there should be, frankly, about
Yes.
Longhorn. Um, and Microsoft, I guess stopped me, but like I've never talked about this in a public forum. Hopefully, I won't get roasted. It'll be interesting to see if other people I worked with have similar refrains because I'm in contact with a few of them still. Um, there was such Microsoft was so high after XP, like it ran the world. Um, and so they're like, why not shoot the moon? And so they're like, we're going to redo the UI stack and do it all in managed code and make it hardware accelerated. We're going to redo the whole file system and make it a database. Like the WinFS was this big thing, right? And then there's this whole thing, we're going to redo identity as well. And I was on the team where they're like, yeah, we're done with IE. Like they scrapped the IE team. They're like, yeah, the browser's done. Um, to think that to write 20 years ago. So think how far the web has come in 20 years. Like you and I are doing like high quality HD video conferencing recording on a web. Like I clicked on a link. Like there was no 20-minute installation with 3 service packs. Like I launched a URL. And to think 20 years ago, like someone in Redmond decided, yeah, the web's done. Like we don't need a dedicated browser team. Um, and so hubris is always the thing, right? Like, and this gets back to the deep fundamentals, right? Like the hubris of, there's clearly nothing else to do here. The hubris of, we can't do no wrong. Like, let's shoot the moon. Losing track of what users really want. Like, as far as I know, no user was asking for a file for a database in the file system, right? And then I'd go into meetings, and it was just like, I was like, they're talking about building business apps and things. I was like, well, doesn't this make more sense on the web? Like when it just, and they're like, well, we need to figure out a way. Again, it was back to like, we need to sell Windows, which is this detached from like, what's the experience we want users to have? How easy could it be? And Google talks about this a lot. The importance of like starting with the user scenario and whether Google does it perfectly is, it's a huge company, right? I think in generally a pretty good idea, which is, how can we make this the best experience possible for the user is a different pivot than like, how do we make sure we keep selling Windows licenses or whatever? I mean, there are people now that, whether it's selling a subscription to X or selling, new device version +1 this year, right? Like it ends up being pretty clear that is the concern and not like what's really best for the user. And it's easy to get, especially when you're high and you're making buttloads of money, it's really easy to lose track of that. I
Yeah.
don't know if there's a solution other than finding some perspective and finding some modesty. But it's tricky because the problem is the kinds of people who can convince others to follow along, the kinds of people who can convince management like this is the thing to go after. Like having modesty and perspective and like there's a very few number of people who actually have overlap, right? The overlap of that Venn diagram is pretty tiny.
Yeah, I think this is where product management really comes in, because one of the big tensions we always have is like how much do you optimize for the user experience, what the user wants, versus how much do you optimize for the business in this case.
Right.
And if you look at Microsoft back then, right? They made almost all their money through selling shrink wrap software. Tools even today, I like except for like maybe Adobe or Autodesk or a handful of companies, tools are not where you go to make a lot of money. It's basically an enabler of something else that you're trying to sell. You're selling the shovels and the pickaxes, and the gold mine or whatever you're going to use them for varies from company to company to company. So I can see from that point of view why Microsoft decided that the internet was not going to be the thing going to invest in heavily beyond a certain point, because they weren't going to be monetizing it. And if they made it any better, it was only going to be to their detriment, because I
Right.
think around that time you saw Open Office was starting to do a lot of, big things there. And you saw all these like rise of like these, it's like Zoho and like these like random companies that became really successful over the years, were all trying to show that you can avoid the whole operating system, avoid the whole lock-in of your device, and do everything in the browser itself. So the browser is even more successful. And I think that if my memory of history is correct, I think the whole internet is a something we need to focus on at Microsoft became really big when Netscape started talking or increasing the volume of their conversations on how you can run the entire world's software on our browser and no longer need anything else. I think that's what got Microsoft to be more interested in this, because that's going to be cannibalizing their own product lines in some
Right.
ways. But if you look at it today, though, right, in many ways, the amount of code that goes into our browsers is probably more than what was in XP or any of these things. Like we just shifted the
Oh,
operating system upward. We just took like, okay, you're running an operating system, but then now you're clicking the icon, for most of us is Chrome or Safari or Firefox or Brave or any other browsers there. But what you're basically loading is another operating system, and now you just have a different UI for it. It's a URL bar instead of the start menu and taskbar. But we replaced the complexity and the things from one layer up to another. And, I'd say we made significant progress in the last 10 years where the web is viable. It's a great platform for building apps. Like you talk about, like we're doing this call right now without installing anything. And that's because the installation was already done. When we installed the browser, all the codecs, all of the many years of working with the web, W3C on like standards for image transmission and audio transmission, the whole webcam mic, all the interfaces.
WebSockets,
Yeah, all
the
these
idea that
things,
we do
right?
streaming is just insanity. If you think back even 15 years, yeah. No plugins,
Exactly. So
you didn't install. What's the version of Flash you've installed or Silverlight? I mean, that was our world, 15
When
years
it's
ago.
like
Yeah.
you didn't know a world beyond the plugin. Yeah, you install the plugin because the plugin gave you more capability than what the browser was able to do, and it could bypass security restrictions the browser enforced.
Yeah.
So you could write the file system. Whether it's a good idea at the time or not, again, goes back to like no one really knew what the implication of security was, or cross-site scripting, or cookie harvesting, where you have a Flash file on one site and they take the cookie from one domain, take it to another. No one really knew all these details, but we did it, and then we learned the hard way these are bad. But
Well, and
I
what's
think
interesting,
it's fun.
thinking about all these like little asterisks, and you think of the iPhone and like, okay, so what was Apple's, you could argue that the fact that Apple didn't support Flash was that, oh, well, Flash is this vector where we don't have the App Store, we don't have the revenue. You could have, certainly, I'm speculating. I don't do this for a living, right? But like, and then the other thing was like, how do you deal with security and privacy and maintaining memory? And so then all these experiences, like, well, the web has to get much better because of this hugely powerful, important platform that doesn't support Flash. And that really pushed the web to get way better. Like I remember when YouTube required Flash, and then for a while it's like, ooh, you could prototype and play with YouTube without a Flash plugin. Like I'm sure most people don't even remember this. And now it's like, of course, YouTube doesn't need a plugin. The whole web doesn't need a plugin. I mean, I remember using, oh, what was the plugin IE that let you do caching of email?
Was it Gears?
Gears. So yeah,
Wow.
before yeah, I mean, Gears was like such a cool little toy. And that was like before the browser supported any notion of like, offline storage or anything else. Um, Again, that was what I talk about this the few times I've talked, being very proud of being at Google. And Dart was initially in the Chrome team. So, and as was Flutter, right? We both kind of came from Chrome. And there was a bunch of flops. There's a bunch of silly stuff that the Chrome team did, or, um, experiments that didn't pan out, but like really pushing like, oh, like what could the web platform do? And it's cool to be kind of part of that legacy. Because it's amazing now. It's a great platform.
Yep, and we often see the same kind of cases, where Microsoft was investing heavily in desktop. We said today with the app stores, for example, the web could be better, but there are some reasons why certain vendors might prefer an app store first approach on these things. And we see this goes back to like history repeating itself again. It's like, yeah, we're seeing the same exact history repeating. It's just that different players, different kind of venue. And the part that always strikes me as really fascinating though is that we have moved to a world where it's generally more open. You're not really locked into using any particular tool. And some of the companies that made that possible were in this case like Microsoft VS Code, for example, where yeah, you can actually build on you're not locked into any particular language or platform. You can code in platforms that are competitive to Microsoft. You can even write Swift on VS Code, which is like something you would have never imagined. Like almost like when at least during our times when we first started working at Microsoft, it's like, yeah, I never would have imagined that, that you'd go that far in tooling. We have a truly agnostic platform for this.
Or even the idea that I vividly remember I was Las Vegas. We'd always go to Las Vegas for these conferences. It was so much better getting to Google, and like, I'd much rather go to San Francisco than Vegas. But I was, you know, a couple levels up above me, execs at Microsoft, and I won't name names. I don't think I can remember names, but I remember the scoffing where this one director, GM, whatever they called him at Microsoft in the .NET world, was scoffing. It's like, oh yeah, this intern we have in C# was asking, well, if I work on this, does this mean I can't work on Mono in my free time? Like I can't go back and contribute to Mono. And they were just like just aghast and annoyed and disgusted that like, so what a silly kid wanting to do open source. And I remember the day where like, oh yeah, .NET, it's all open source now, and like you can run it on your Mac and Docker and everything else. You know, obviously sitting outside, you know, not working for Microsoft anymore, but it has been super cool to see kind of Microsoft get religion here around the value of openness, and the work they've done with VS Code and other things. Um, Even on the WASM side and the engine side, you know, there's been a little bit of trolling on Twitter recently from some of the marketing folks there, but like in terms of the contributions that Microsoft's now making towards the Chromium browser and things, it's great for the ecosystem. It's exciting. It makes me happy.
Yeah, I mean, developers benefit, and there's always a business angle to all of these as well, like why it's being done that way, and it's fine though because at this time the pendulum is swinging to the point where, like, yeah, there's like clearly a business direction why these decisions are being made, but it also happens to benefit us as developers and end
Right.
users greatly, which wasn't always the case. It wasn't always the case that what was good for the business and what's good for the user were on the same side of the coin. And that's where like the culture of the company and what you ultimately wanted out of your career often played a big role. Is like, do you want to sleep well at night and know that you've done a
Right.
good thing for your developer audiences that you care about, or do you want to continue to be seen as a key part of working in a team that you might be a part of at the time?
Yeah, and even and I look at like Docker was such a mind blowing technology. And I think that the company's working hard and trying to find a business model, and it's tricky, but like they gave this gift to the world, and the realization, like, oh yeah, we can't do another proprietary thing. Like someone else will just make it for us, right? Or even looking at Microsoft, like or at Google with databases. I grew up when it's like, okay, it's like Oracle or SQL Server, right? We're kind of your choices. And then you look at AlloyDB now, and it's like this crazy scale out, highly resilient, redundant. Um, and it's like, oh yeah, that's Postgres compliant, which is kind of the best of both. So like, if you think Microsoft, if you think of Google can deploy, I've talked about Microsoft too much. My inner brain that still says we thinking of Microsoft, it never goes away, right? Like Google with AlloyDB, like Google has some spectacular special sauce there, and it's good that we have the differentiation, but also realizing like, oh yeah, from day one, like lock-in's not even, there's always these jokes about making things sticky. Like, how can we make this sticky so they have to stick with us? It's like your stickiness can be the user experience. Your stickiness can be how many nines you offer reliably, those things. The idea that like, oh, you're going to code to our like proprietary one-off standard and be stuck with us, like I think the ecosystem has grown up there. Like, yeah, we're not going to play that anymore. Like, I need to be able
Yeah.
to move somewhere else tomorrow.
You're just
Um,
one API call away from, any cloud provider. You're just one minor object signature away from being able to adapt your existing logic to work on anything else that needs to be done. So yeah, the lock-in has shifted, I guess. I don't know where it has shifted to, but it's definitely not in the layer of like the APIs and the tools that we use. Because back then, if you wrote, in Java, for example, or if you wrote in, let's say, like, ASP script, like VB script, I mean, VB script isn't even supported anymore. Like, do you remember back in the day when we used to type in JavaScript? You could actually type script type equals, and you could actually type in JS or VB or VB script. Like, you actually had an option in the HTML spec for what kind of
run
script that you
VB.
wanted to
Oh
do.
my gosh! And people got mad at us. Yeah, like Dart was not the first team to try to get another language in the browser. And honestly, I think that's actually a great object lesson, right? Which is there's some very aspirational people, the founders of the Dart team, who are no longer at Google, also still doing interesting things, frankly. And so good to be audacious. Like, hey, let's add a new language to the browser. And there was a lot of friction, even within the Chrome team, which is I think credit to the Chrome team, both from a pragmatic perspective, like just the work involved to support two separate heaps and garbage collection, like it's a very difficult thing. But also in terms of the ecosystem, like, is it? Can you imagine a world where Mozilla or Apple would do the work to support a different language? And so, you know, that didn't work out, frankly, and I quote this a few times, which is my Iowa comes out, which is, I think it's a Garth Brooks song, thank God for unanswered prayers kind of thing. Um, thank God we didn't get into the browser. Like, one, it'd be a pain in the rear end in terms of managing release cycles and all the things, right? Like the web teams dealing with versions and compatibility, like, and what we ended up, there was that experiment in the Chrome team, and also native client was the other thing, right? It's like, oh, let's take Intel assembly and later ARM assembly, and there's a thing called Pinnacle or PNACL, portable native client for people that don't know. Let's see if we can get assembly language running in the browser. And there were cool things. I think Google Maps used it. We had a few products that actually used NACL um, and Pinnacle. And then, but clearly that was going to be a one-off thing and a weird technology. And then the Mozilla folks did ASM.js and now WASM. And now it's so delightful. Um, uh, being on a team, two teams, Dart and Flutter, that kind of came from the Chrome team, and we're back now. It's like, oh no, like this is we were waiting for WebGL to get good in the browser. We were waiting for garbage collection to support well in the browser, and now we have crazy fast runtime performance, and we're making it work in the browser today. And it's not this one-off Google specific hack. It's not a plugin. It's like just using standard web technology, soon to be ubiquitous. I think WASM stuff's coming up on WASM GC's coming up in phase 4. Um, and I went this crazy high performance language model and really high performance, like cutting edge graphics. Um, Frankly, within a rounding error of AAA, like some of the stuff you can pull off in the browser today is spectacular in terms of fidelity and performance and frame rates and everything else. And there's no plugins, no one-offs. Just I think it's been 3 weeks now. We finally got support. We flipped all the bits now, so we run in Firefox, and that's spectacular. It's actually interesting, even from an ecosystem perspective, because for a while, like it was Chrome only from this Google open source thing, and so people roll their eyes. And now we work in Firefox, and now the discussion switched, which is instead of this Chrome Google only thing, now it's like, oh, where's Safari? It's amazing, just a little bit of work to and again, getting back to our old discussions about browser support and ecosystems, right? Which is there's certain like not having to deal with IE anymore makes our life so much easier. But I hate monocultures as well, like having to think about Firefox and Safari. Maybe I'll bite my tongue if you can't say something nice, kind of thing. They're certainly doing a bunch of work, but not having a monoculture, having places where as slow as it is and tedious as it is to get the standards work happening, it does end up making a better web. Like we've had to think harder about things, and that comes with legacy. It comes with workarounds and less than ideal. But it's I don't know who said it. I always remember Al Gore. I think in one of his movies, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so it seems like there's more of that, like people going together on things. And the results are spectacular. Like it's the best time ever to be in computing. It's super exciting.
No, I completely agreed. And you look at like going beyond it with like all the work around AI and things like that, where the bar is much lower now, where someone who wants to build an app or taking advantage of these technologies
Yeah.
can just go and do so. When I was never, I didn't know much about WebAssembly. I still don't know anything about WebAssembly actually. But when I found out Figma was built using, and you're like, wow, wait a minute, something that I use all the time for my graphic design work happened to be made possible only because of like the technology that they've been I saw the founders post mortem after the acquisition talking about like here's some of the first things we did, which is like little visual experiments and things like that. I'm like, wow, that's where it started. Here's how it ended, and all because the technology unlocked a whole class of applications they would have never really been able to performantly do if you didn't have this kind of thing. And so I always look to like what's possible in the future, or what are things that are being built that no one really knows what can be done, but can be game changers in their own way.
Yeah. I need to. I know you've spent some time on the AI stuff. I haven't on the machine learning. I've played with Bard a bit and some of the other things. Um, I think it'll be a big deal, almost certainly. I'm still curious to see kind of what we end up doing on the programming side, um, and scaling from like one page of code to like full libraries and frameworks and applications. I'm glad there's many players in this space, and I'm glad there's so many options in the open, you know, in the open realm. Again, because I uh, monocultures are bad, so it's good to have choice and variety. It's cool to see it evolving so quickly as well.
Yeah, if I had to speculate, right? Like just like how you can go to like, Terraform and have like a YAML file or something, you specify like I want infrastructure A, B, and C. I want to talk to A, B, and C here. Send it out to some magical machine. It comes back with like here's a URL endpoint that you can access, right? I have no idea how any of it works, but all I do know is a syntax for making sure the file is structured in a way where the system can understand it. So in many ways, you might say this mentioned all the time is that the whole prompt engineering, like the prompts you feed your AI system, that can be its own programming language at some point. With BASIC, we saw English becoming more of the norm in terms of like natural words being what you use to specify what a computer can do. Python took it to another level, in terms of like capabilities you can access very quickly without weird syntax and things like that. And many other languages, of course. But now it turns out that AI could be the one where go to ChatGPT or Bard, you can type in pure English if you want to, and then it will do things. And the quality of how you specify what needs to be done will determine what you do. And you can actually even go extremely detailed and specify the conditions: do this, don't do this, and so on. And that becomes its own language.
I think it's one of those things like I don't want my old fogey to show. I still I've seen the demos. I'm compelled by the demos and the examples, people doing real work. Um, if you're doing like write this paragraph for me, or the joke again that I've seen a few times now that I think is hilarious is the people who say, okay, take these three bullets and turn this into three paragraphs. So I seem like I have some gravitas here. And then on the receiving end, it's like, okay, take these three paragraphs, just give me the three bullets. It's like, what an insanely lost, like what, waste of CPU cycles, megawatts, whatever you want to say, like, is this what we're going to do now, I guess. Um, but certainly compelling, but also like English can be, vague. And when you think about an algorithm, it's like, no, I want these conditions, these preconditions to be very explicit, you know, and so, I have a strict notion of what I want to run and when I want it to run and how I want it to run and all the exceptions and everything else. And so, starting with vague language and getting there, like for UI, I'm super excited. And I think it'll be interesting to see, certainly in our world with Flutter and UIs, it's like, okay, like, can I go in and say, like, I want the UI to be more playful. I want, and again, this is me just speculating. We're nothing, I don't know anyone working on any of this stuff, but I think it's interesting to play with and think about. Um, uh, I want the UI to be more fun. I want it to be looser. I want it to be tighter. I want the margins bigger. I want it to be more. I don't know. Like, and like, I could imagine. I can imagine giving Bard, a Windows 95 app. You can imagine this at least, and say, okay, make this look like a Star Trek UI. Maybe can figure that out. It's like, okay, but like, what's the artifact and code I generate, whether it's Flutter code or CSS and HTML, whatever? Like, what's the artifact you generate underneath so that works and accessibility still works and the hit testers are still set up? Like, I'm sure people are working on it, but like in my mind, I don't have that threaded through yet. Like, how are we going to make that actually work? I'm excited by it.
I'm I'm more of the hopeful that all this will be solved. Like for me, until I saw like people on Twitter saying like I have no programming experience, but here I created a snake game with sound and all this.
right.
I'm like, wow. It's like for not having any idea of like what in this code does, that the AI system was able to help them and the quality of it was reasonably well done also. It wasn't like I looked at it, I was like, yeah, it's actually not bad. Like, it takes account of like various refresh rates, so it's not like faster for some people, slower for some other people. It takes into account like various input modes. I'm like, this was actually well thought out by the AI system, which of course trained probably on some very well made snake games. This
Of
learned
course.
like,
Right.
pattern match from like A to B, like what needs to be done here. But at a certain point though, a lot of what we do is kind of like goes like cycles again, right? It's just repeating what we've done in the past, just trying something slightly different, or maybe the same exact thing without any variation because you might have done something really successful 20 years ago and you're like, yeah, I'm not changing that formula at all. I'm going to repeat that exact same thing right now. The context might be different, but the output and the inputs are going to be exactly the same. It's exactly what an AI system does in many ways really, really well. And I think the UI part of that always excites me. And actually, like someone I talked to earlier, Chloe Barrow, where I talked exactly about this thing. She's an HCI, like, computer researcher and like, human computer interaction. I've been thinking is like, what if we get to the point where the UI that I'm interacting with is dynamically generated by the AI system? I might prefer colors that are more in the blue color. Like I like blue colors and like gradients, for example. You might prefer like, like more like natural colors, like, grays and greens and so on. And it doesn't matter because when I'm viewing an app, it's going to be dynamically recreated visually for my particular taste. The logo might be uniquely the same, doesn't change ever for branding purposes and so on, but everything in the app is going to be different. Like I prefer vertical navigation, you might prefer horizontal navigation, or you might prefer more images, less text, and things like that. Each person will have their own personalized app experience where the core experience will be, what are the output you're trying to optimize for? So like, I want to sell more products, I want people to understand my portfolio, things like that. That goal will be the only constant there, but how it translates into success for each person is going to be completely hyper personalized. And that's the part I'm actually very excited about.
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, there's always makes me think of, there's so many things. The way I've been thinking about the AI impact, it's a difference between, in my mind, like the difference between like carpentry and architecture. We need a world of savvy carpenters, like craftspeople, right? um, which is, and driving through suburbia or whatever else, or in Seattle, you're happily to think, there's local governments and things that are getting smarter and savvy about density, right, with the housing crisis and everything else, build. And so you have, and it ends up being a lot of cookie cutter, right? There's only so many ways to hang a door and do it correctly. I remember we built a backyard cottage behind my house a few years ago. Before COVID, it was great. But these two craftsmen were back there cranking along by themselves. They built a whole mini house. Like um, it was a little bit kind of a template based thing. It was meant to be fast, but they're just experts. And we wanted the staircase to go off to one side instead of the front, so we could pull a car in the back, whatever. And he's like, "Oh, okay. So you need to, we need a deck this wide. It's like, okay, is it 30 inches or 36 inches?" And I listened to him do the phone call. He's like, "Okay." And like then I just watched him, and he didn't have a design, or like, it wasn't IKEA with like a list of parts. He's like, "Oh, I need to build a deck." And so you think about like, what's the minimum width so the door can open, so that it's ADA compliant, like what's the run on the stairs so that you can get up safely, all the rules. And it was just all in his head. And he just sat there and built the deck. And I'm sitting there blown away. I was like, how could you do that? And then what I realized is like, you and I could, someone's like, okay, make me a CRUD app to like take in first name, last name, and date, birthday, whatever else, and like, oh yeah, master details, and like, it's the exact same thing. And so to bring it around to AI, sorry for my long analogy, but like things that we think are magical, right? It's all relative. And so maybe it's like if you're at the very beginning of programming, the AI stuff is spectacular. Just like if you're very beginning of music, what's available to you today versus 30 years ago with YouTube and everything else, like you can get started so fast. And then if you're the best, if you're the top, whatever entile of whether it's graphic design or audio design or writing, fiction, whatever, you're probably safe, right? Because someone has to build inputs to the models. And what I'm worried about is like, I think there's a lot of folks and jobs in the middle there where you've gotten savvy, right? Like you spend your life making reports, or you spend your life, doing summaries of the quarter, or what, or building master detail forms over data stuff.
Yeah.
And I think those jobs are going to be the most tricky because there's a lot of people making a lot of money and paying mortgages and sending kids to school and saving for retirement doing that type of work. And I struggle to see how that's going to survive. Like you'll have to, yeah,
Yeah, it's going to be very tricky. We call it, what's the phrase? Creative destruction, where you're
yeah,
now doing more higher value tasks than we did before. And it's one thing to say like, okay, I'm doing like physical billboards and printing to now I'm using Adobe Photoshop and doing things more digitally. Yes, there's a learning curve. There's a way to do it. But I think we're seeing wholesale the entire job that you might be doing being completely replaced by AI. And there is no next step to some of these activities. It's like, okay, there's nothing beyond like some of the work, like I don't know, let's pick an example of like I'm summarizing a document, right? There's only so much you can do in summarizing. Like it's the point where like you get diminishing returns after a certain point. It's like, yeah, after the AI is summarizing it, great. There's no like post summarization activity beyond it that also cannot be automated away.
unless you're the person writing the AI that does the summarization. But the number of people doing
Exactly.
that, in my
Exactly.
mind, it's Craigslist and classified ads.
Yeah.
Like, and again, I mean, at the risk of getting philosophical as we approach an hour, but maybe it's appropriate, right? Like, there was so much good journalism that was supported, investigative journalism, just local awareness of news, even
Yeah.
bringing together of community, right? Like for good or bad, like locally owned paper, like a sense of community and connection, people around me. Like it was all built on like, looking for, used car, 1980s or newer, four doors, prefer AC, like, and then Craigslist came along and spectacular, like it changed the whole industry, but also like all the importance of journalism and community and local identity and all this stuff. It's just like, oh, it's built on like, it's like the joke about the whole internet based built on this tiny little thing maintained by someone in Nebraska. Like the idea that like, civility and freedom of information and awareness of, not overly polarized, news. It's like, oh yeah, just all on classified ads, and those make no sense anymore because Craigslist, and eBay. Um,
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what we talked about earlier on, like, do you work on the next big thing or do you make the existing one a little bit better? And, you look at what Craigslist succeeded, it totally makes sense because the user convenience was massive. You had this, like, database, you could see, like, people were there. Of course, the chicken and egg problem with any social network is, like, you need to classify, you also need people posting them, you need people searching for them. And the timing of it was just right. So the Craigslist team did a good job on that angle. And then you go back and go like, could the classified industry have foreseen this? Could they have seen that, the internet is going really big? People are using that as their primary source for like, basic information, news. They go to search, could have been Alta Vista at the time or Lycos. Now everyone is like using Google. And they try to go what's like the most relevant thing there. How can we adapt our service to make that happen? And oftentimes it goes back to we're so pigeonholed into like the next milestone, the next thing needs to be done, and so on, that we never take. Actually, we don't have bandwidth to take a step back and go like, wait, are we still solving a problem that's worth solving, or has the world moved on to something completely new? And I
what
think that's the question there.
Well, and it's also like, you know, if you're a horseshoer or a livery stable company, like, are you in a better position to go build automobiles than just someone starting from scratch? You're probably in a worse state. Like,
Yeah,
just because you have your existing infrastructure and existing customers. I mean, you look at all the politics around green energy and people like, oh, we'll push hydrogen, or in Texas, we're going to tax electric vehicles far more than the gas tax we get from like it's like, oh, well, what do you do to like maintain a hold, and just be utterly so I think there's economic things and societal things we'll need to be reflective on that. I have two brothers who are musicians, and so thinking back, you saw the ads from the early 1900s about the evil robot. It could be ML today. Like, it's so funny, but like the scary ads of like the machine recording. It's like, if you wanted to enjoy music, you had to have someone live perform it for you, and so that means a lot more. There's a lot of mediocre musicians in the world, because it's like, if you wanted music at your theater thing, or you had to hire someone. And so it's this interesting dichotomy, which is it's easier to get great at music today than it ever has been. I can watch lessons from the best guitar player, the best trombone player, whatever, for hours and hours for free, for the cost of a YouTube subscription or watching some
yeah.
ads. At the same time, the demand for that skill in terms of making money is dramatically lower. Like,
Exactly. I recently wrote about the power law and how it's applying to AI here. We always have like very few people benefiting the most from like any of these things. Have a long tail of individuals who are just kind of like going on for the ride. And what AI has done is like made it even more narrow. It's like, the people who are like, let's take music, for example, right? I might have been willing to pay like, X amount for like some background music for like a video, for example. Now I'm just gonna go to like some AI tool and just type in like what I want and download that. Will it be as good as something created by another human being? Probably not, but
at
I'm
least
not
not
a
today.
musician. I don't have like the trained ear to be like, this is absolutely not the right thing. So to me, I'm like, okay, this meets my price point of free, and the quality exceeded what I think would be applicable. And then I'm happy there at the detriment of a qualified musician who would rather have been able to do this. I mean, so it's playing over and over again with like Fiverr and like all of these other kind of services where like, before you had a logo people, you hired a logo agency, I just pay like $10 to some website and they give you like 8 logo variations, and you're like, okay, this is good enough. So it's just kind of repeating itself over and over again.
Yeah, it's the whole, like, from what I've heard, it was not a Chinese proverb. It's completely misattributed. But the idea of like, may you live in interesting times, as a thing. Like, we certainly live in interesting times. Um,
Very much so.
but
And you mentioned earlier, like, what if you're really good? What if you're the best at something? Like you might have a better chance, being successful here. But then, what if you're the best at something that doesn't really matter? What if you're the best horseshoer in Washington State? Does it really matter though? Because I don't see that many net new horses, being like, put on the roads, for example, right? It won't be at scale as it what it used to be. Like, how do you know that you're the best at something that no longer matters? Like, how will you ever be able to figure that out? Because you probably tied up a lot of your identity and your history into doing what you are really good at. And
Well,
so, how do you figure that out?
but horseshoeing. So let's talk about horseshoeing. It's just an example here, right? I think it's an interesting analogy, which is like the difference between the best horseshoer and the average horseshoer. Does it practically matter if you, I mean, it's so funny. I was just at a thing yesterday for a 9-year-old's birthday party. We went to a stable and they rode around in the circle, on their horses. So I have a very visceral thing about horseshoeing. It's like the difference between the average horseshoer and the best horseshoer. Is it enough to really matter? I mean, maybe if you're racing, maybe if you're at the Kentucky Derby, and then
Yeah.
maybe if you are the best horseshoer, maybe not Washington State, maybe Kentucky, right? You probably still have a job, right? Because there's people who still bet on horse racing, right? And those things really matter. Um, but I like making this analogy even with lifting weights, right? Like the difference between the average strength of a 25-year-old man versus the strongest 25-year-old man in the world, maybe 3x or 4x. It's not 10x. It's not 10x by any man, right? Like it's not I can bench 150 pounds versus 1500. Like no one can bench 1500. The difference between the average surgeon and the best surgeon is probably 10x or maybe 100x. The difference between the average musician, the average basketball player, like there are skill based, mind based things. I guess horseshoeing in some respects is a skill, right? But like, there's no 100x or 1000x things there. And so the fact that we have technology now where if that person's in, Milford, Iowa or Seattle, Washington or Mumbai or, um, Kathmandu, like the fact that we have access to that person's brain and they have the tools to do things, that's spectacular. Because before, I mean, as much as I dislike Friedman from the Times for many reasons, he did say some good things, right? Which is like, oh, like, you'd rather be a C student from the States than an A plus student in many places in the developing world, and that's quickly changing. And I think generally that's a good thing, right? Like people can be empowered in all these places. Like all you need is an internet connection and a browser. Like a $200 Chromebook from all intents and purposes, is as good as the $3,500 Vision Pro, whatever, in terms of being able to get a lot of stuff done on the internet. And that's a great thing. The democratization of those things is great. But there certainly will be a cost. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, some will benefit, some will not, because it goes back to the thing I mentioned earlier about at some point the gains or the benefit you have will be driven down to zero by competition or so on. So any unique monopoly that we all may have had in like being able to hire the best talent or being able to do some of these things as a country, for example, are going to be made more competitive as quality of life increases worldwide, and people might decide to stay there and build what use their brain power to benefit their own localities as opposed to coming here, which is a net gain for them, a loss for us. I mean, still might be still on the positive end of the benefits. It is gradually going to be decreasing to zero if the equation of that holds true for like every other part of the world that we're in.
And I think, to try to wrap things up a little bit too, I need to go. I have WAS and web things to go worry about, which is exciting. So anyone who's, and worrying about the stuff I'm worrying about, it's great. But thinking about our history too, like, there's a power of platforms. And so I know you're doing work. I don't know. I actually have no idea how much public what you're working on now is. It's really cool, folks. Pay attention.
Yeah, not
Um,
public at all yet.
can't say it, but like building tools and empowering people. Like we're in the same business. I think we've loved it. Clearly, we've come back around. I took a break to go work on other things and came back to platform stuff. So building tools, and I think you can think broadly about platforms, right? Whether it's a government or a culture, a tool, like how to make people feel safe, make people feel productive, make people feel connected, letting people contribute, helping people learn, feel safe in that space, feel free to make mistakes, paying attention to things that matter and versus don't, and you can think about in terms of like the operating system you run, or you can think about your gender identity, right? Like, should it matter? And like, no, like, um, um, and that's good. So I'm excited to be working on the platform I am here, and then you can think more broadly about the communities we build, um, um, and the governments we support and the policies we support. Like it's all about platforms and connections, and not thinking zero sum. And that's I think also the power of platform thinking, right? Which is if you think in terms of like, well, I want the biggest slice of the pie and I don't care how big the pie is. Like it's very reductionist thinking and it's very backwards thinking. And if you're always thinking about growth and change as a good thing and making the pie bigger, there's some really good sauce there, some really good juice there to have fun at work and also have a good life and have a world we want to live in. So I'm excited to be on that journey and road with you too, and hopefully we'll keep it up.
Well, Kevin, there's no better way for me to conclude this than what you just said. So that was fantastic.
It's all recorded, right? Because there's no way I could come with that another time.
No, it's of course it's recorded.
I'm so excited you're doing this. Dimitri, someone else that we both work with. It's so good to get these conversations. So keep having great conversations. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no time, and absolutely next time around, hopefully I'll have you again. There's much more to talk about. I can totally sense it.
We
So
could go on for hours, I'm sure.
exactly. All right, thanks, Kevin. Talk to you in a bit.